all you guys who scoff at this kind of thing, had you bought this sweater instead, you could have, what, almost tripled your money. Today's video is sponsored by Forever Pick, exotic wood guitar picks. Handmade one at a time in Chicago, Illinois, you can choose from a selection of exotic woods that will actually improve your guitar's tone. Take advantage of an exclusive 25% off coupon when you buy the full 6-pack at the link in the description. And remember, when you support my sponsors, you support this channel, and I sure appreciate it.
Hey y'all, it's a shitpost weekend on Channel 2.
Gibson has lost yet another one of its trademarks. Apparently in the EU, there is an authority that rules on such things, and they have ruled that Gibson cannot have a trademark on it.
I hate this channel.
No! No! Also, an interesting news story that I just saw. Dave Mustaine, of course, the founder and longtime guitarist and singer for Megadeth, is putting a bunch of his stuff up on Reverb. You know, every now and then you get a famous musician who will put a bunch of stuff up on Reverb. We've seen artists like Billy Corgan do this. We've seen the guitarists from Oasis do this. A lot of other guitar players have put stuff up on Reverb and have gotten their own, you know, official shop. But yeah, check out some of the stuff that Dave is getting rid of here.
I have a lot of guitars that to somebody else would mean the world. To me, it's a quiver. I have a lot of gear. I've got a lot of double neck guitars. I've got a lot of prototype stuff. I've got absolutely killer collector's item stuff for the right guy. For me, my job is to put everything I can into this guitar so that when it gets put into somebody else's hand, I can say, this is the guitar that wrote Holy Wars. As far as the gear is concerned, there's a lot of small detailed stuff that we have in our storage, stuff that goes back to the very beginning of the band. Simple little teeny things that are absolutely insignificant to a player, stuff that's, little tiny stuff. Somebody that was a legacy kind of a collector, I have always believed when it comes down to memorabilia with the band, especially instruments, I want to pass this on to people. I want them to be able to have something that I had. This is all whirling electrons. This thing is in motion right now. It's all molecules. You would think that it's not moving, but it's moving. It totally is. And I like whatever energy I put into this, my particular mojo. I like to be able to give that to somebody. When I die, I don't want a guitar in my coffin. When you see some of these guys want to be buried with stuff, I don't want to die. I want to live forever.
Yeah, so interesting, that Dave Mustaine mentions death and his own mortality there at the end, and he says, I don't want to die, I want to live forever. He has been plagued with some cancer scares of late, and of course we reported on that when that happened recently, when it came out that Dave was battling cancer. Obviously we don't like to see people like this drop off, but the reality is we are human beings and we do drop off. And I like what he said there about, I don't want to be buried with any of this stuff. This stuff has got to go with some other people. So, I kind of wonder whether, Dave might be secretly planning for such an eventuality, that he understands his mortality now. He knows he's getting close, and maybe, it's time for him to unload this stuff because he feels like, he might not be around much longer. One naturally asks the question. All the best to Dave. Hopefully he is able to sell some of his stuff. It looked like he had a few really nice things. He had a really cool DW drum set that looked like it was some kind of maybe bubinga or some kind of exotic wood, and then it has a big Megadeth insignia on the bass drum, so it was probably concert used. Then you've got a couple of guitars, Flying V it looks like, and maybe an Explorer shape Dean that he's going to be selling. Also a lot of little things like drum machines and old wireless units and stuff like that he signed, and little things like that might maybe the little guy can afford. Also, since we're talking about gear from famous guitarists, the collection that belonged to Steely Dan guitarist Walter Becker that was recently auctioned off, they ended up bringing $3.3 million from all that stuff, and he had amassed like an enormous collection. I mean, really, really a lot of nice stuff. A couple of viewers to the channel, one in particular, said that he had scored some of the stuff, you know, pretty cheap actually. He was really surprised to even want any of it, but the thing is, there was so much of it, and he said he got it for a reasonable price, and you know, and it was like 600 guitars, 400 amplifiers that this guy had amassed. You know, of course, Walter Becker died back in 2017, but he had all this gear and these storage spaces in New York and Hawaii. But I didn't report on it on this channel because it seemed to be everywhere anyway. And sometimes sometimes I kind of weigh that stuff out and kind of make editorial decisions on Shitpost Fridays about the stuff I want to report on. So that was something that kind of got cold because it was like, well, you know, I'm sure anybody who's interested in this probably has already seen it because it seems to be front page news on all the guitar websites anyway. Plus, I'll be quite honest with you, I never liked Steely Dan. I admire Walter Becker's technicality as a guitarist. He's an amazing guitarist, but I never cared for Steely Dan's music. They just didn't really touch me. But I tell you what, some of the stuff that he had definitely rang my bell because he had a lot of old Valcos, Dan Electro amps, you know, old Gibson amps, like all the stuff that I like and that we talk about on this channel. He had tons of this stuff. He had some really cool guitars that were like just off the beaten path, you know, not rock star collectible type stuff that you would normally think of. You know, he had a lot of stuff that had been built specifically for him, a lot of boutique guitars. It was an interesting auction, and if you guys had a chance to check it out, you'll know what I mean. Also in the world of auctions and dead rock stars, we've got Kurt Cobain's, one of his guitars that he played on the In Utero tour, and also the iconic sweater that he wore in the MTV Unplugged show. According to Rolling Stone, this is the second time in 4 years that this sweater has been auctioned, and it looks like the last time it was auctioned in 2015. It sold for $137,500 through Julian's Auctions, far exceeding its $60,000 estimate. It sold for over $330,000. I mean, quite an investment. All you guys who scoff at this kind of thing, it's like, you know, oh, why would you ever spend that kind of money? That's more than my house, you know? Well, $137,000 is actually, you know, that's money that some people might even have sitting in the bank waiting to buy an investment property or something. And, you know, had you bought this sweater instead 4 years ago, you could have, almost tripled your money, you know? So, not quite, I'm sure after auction fees and everything, maybe doubled your money. But, I mean, shit, that's a lot of money, dude, to be making. You probably won't get those kinds of returns invested in real estate, you know, in 4 years. I can't think of anywhere you could invest in real estate and come out like that in 4 years time. You know, that's a lot of money to make. The difference between 137 and 330, you know, $200,000 they made just buying something, sitting on it for 4 years, not washing it, you know, and it hasn't been washed since he wore it on MTV's Unplugged. Probably stinks to high heaven now, but it really is. It's an iconic sweater. Anytime I think of MTV Unplugged, I think of Nirvana, you know, and anytime I think of Nirvana's Unplugged set, I think of him sitting there in that sweater. And anybody who grew up at that time, you know, that's going to be an iconic image probably for the next, you know, 40 or 50 years until that generation dies off. So it's probably, you could even buy it the next time it comes up for auction and still make some money on it at some point, you know. So for people who scoff at buying stuff like this, man, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Memorabilia, you know, that's connected to famous people or famous guitar players or musicians can be worth a lot of money, and really, you know, the sky's the limit on some of that stuff. So, I mean, if you've got the money to put into something like that, as long, you know, if, for instance, if one of the guitars that Dave Mustaine was putting up for sale was the guitar that he wrote Holy Wars on and recorded it on or whatever, I would say, you know, if you could afford it, consider it. Because, you know, I mean, there's probably always going to be somebody out there who would want to have the guitar that Dave Mustaine recorded or wrote Holy Wars on. You know what I mean? Because that's, you know, it was their greatest album, probably. Their most well-known. And that's probably the most well-known song from that album. and it's probably the most well-known Megadeth song. For a Megadeth fan, it's an iconic thing. Now, is Megadeth as big as Metallica or something like that? You know, no. But at the same time, you know, if it comes up that James Hetfield is going to sell the guitar that he wrote and recorded Enter Sandman on, you know, which was arguably their biggest song, or maybe one, you know, was perhaps their biggest song, or, you know, whatever. If he sold that guitar, you know, that would be something to really consider long and hard about buying if you have the money for it. Because as we've seen with these auctions, man, these people just buy this shit and they sit on it for a few years and then flip it again and usually make bank on this stuff, because there's always somebody out there, and you have to wait for the right time. That's the thing. You have to wait until the artist is maybe back in the news. You know, maybe somebody has released a new documentary about this artist. So that's a great time to sell. It's like if you've been sitting on a piece of memorabilia for years and years, you know, and then the artist has kind of faded a little bit into obscurity with a new generation, and then they come out with something like the Queen biopic, you know. So if you're sitting on something from Freddie Mercury, like one of his outfits or something, and then they come out with the Queen biopic, that would be the time to unload that outfit, you know what I mean, or that guitar or that piano or whatever it is you have. You know, that's a piece of memorabilia. But yeah, that's the way this stuff works, man. It comes and goes in cycles, and people who play these cycles are very smart. And if you have the money to burn on this kind of stuff, and you have the time and patience to wait, you could make quite a mint. And a lot of people do that, and that's basically part of their investment portfolio. So it just is what it is. I know a lot of people, they look down upon this like it's some kind of affront to art, the artistry, you know, or the artistic mindset really always looks down on that. You know, you're exploiting someone's memory, or you're basically a vulture coming along and picking the bones clean after the fact. Well, I mean, if you don't do it, someone else is going to. So that's just the way it is. And the people who buy the stuff, a lot of the times, you know, if they are buying it as a piece of memorabilia that they're going to display in their house or in their business or something like that, they probably already love that artist anyway, and it's just an expression of their love to own something that was so closely connected to that artist, you know. And then they'll always be able to say, I used to own that thing, you know. So it's kind of, you get the bragging rights from it, you get whatever you make from the, you know, the sale of it, you know. So there's a lot of upside to getting into the memorabilia market. But let me know what you guys think about this. I mean, is this something that you see as like, is this vulturism, or is this like exploiting their memory, or do you think that this is some, you know, it's fair game, that, you know, if you have the money to burn and you can try to make something on it, then, you know, I mean, like I said, you know, it's almost like a piece of real estate. You know, you're just buying something different instead of something cold and, you know, silly like blue chip stock or something. You're putting it into something that is tangible, that really means something to you, you know. So that's the other side of it to look at too. But let me know what you think down below. But yeah, that will do it for the news. So I thought we would do some Ask an Amp Tech.
When you don't know what the fuck you're doing, time for Ask an Amp Tech.
Okay, this message comes from Henry Nevelainen. I'm sure I butchered that. Nevelainen. Says, hi there, I'm Henry Nevelainen. You're going to make me pronounce it again. Henry Nevelainen. Longtime follower of your channel from Finland. Okay, cool. Yeah, man, I've got a few.
That armor's too strong for blasters.
I got a few people who watch this channel from Finland. It says, I've been trimming and modding guitars since I started to play guitar, and for the last few years I've tried to learn how tube amps work. I have an electrical education. So to the point, this week I somehow started to think about how older capacitors have a polarity and outer foil marking on them, and the modern ones do not. Is there any tester or trick how I could find the correct polarity? After a few videos and sites later, I found this really easy tester, a guitar amp. Just switch the amp on, put some gain, and touch the guitar cable's tip and sleeve with the capacitor lead. So what you're doing, you're putting the capacitor from the tip to the sleeve, and then your fingers make interference in the polarity Makes less noise if the when the outer foil is toward ground. Have you heard about this trick? Yeah, you know, that's one way you can try to test them. That's not going to be all that reliable, to be quite honest. And I'll be honest with you also, Henry, you can find there's videos out there of how you can test these things. There is one video by Mr. Carlson's lab. He goes through all this, and he talks about and he emphasizes the importance of outer foil and stuff in capacitors and getting all that right. But I will contend that in modern guitar amps, for the most part, it doesn't matter a lick. On guitar amps, period, it really is not gonna. You'll never notice the difference whether the foil is backwards or not on most guitar amps. The only time you'll have to worry about whether one of your coupling capacitors, signal capacitors, is backwards, it is when you have a wire that's like an AC wire somewhere running right by it. You know, maybe that's running parallel to the capacitor that's sitting right on the side of the capacitor. You know, in that case, you might get some noise, but in most guitar amps, first of all, you're not going to have that situation if it's laid out properly. Second of all, if you do have that situation, all you have to do is just move the wire, and you won't get that anymore. You know, if you have one of those capacitors that's maybe in close proximity to magnetic flux off of a transformer, you know, maybe you can get some noise that way too that's induced. That might be a little bit more noise slightly than you would get otherwise, like if it was the other way around. You know, but generally, I mean, yes, you would want to put your capacitors in where the outer foil is shielding the inner foil. You want the inner foil to face whatever side of the circuit has the most voltage potential from ground, essentially, is what you want. So whichever one is closest to 0 volts is the one that you want to be the outer foil, because that's the one that's gonna tend to block any RF radio interference. But the thing is, you know, modern capacitors are so much smaller on average than your old capacitors. I mean, let me give you an example. Okay, let me just pick one of these capacitors. So let's go. Well, actually, that's kind of hard to get to. Let's go with 0.01. All right, I've got a couple of 0.01s here. Got a couple of different ones. Let's just go with a couple of these modern ones, and I want to try to keep it at, you know, kind of similar in values. But look, I mean, for example, here is a modern 0.01 capacitor that is 600. This is 630 volts rated. Okay, here is a 600 volt rated 0.01 capacitor. That's new old stock. That's an older capacitor. I mean, look at this difference in size. This is the newer one. This is the older one. Same value, same voltage rating. They will work in the amp the same way. But this one is so much smaller, you're going to get a hell of a lot less interference. It's a lot less of an antenna. That's more of an efficient antenna than this thing. If you've messed much with radios, you know, or old TVs, you know, when you had the bunny ears and stuff, the bigger your antenna was, usually, you know, the better your reception was going to be. And, you know, it's kind of the same way with these capacitors. Here's a whole bunch of older capacitors. I mean, look at this thing. So here we've got, once again, here's our modern capacitor. These are the types that I use as well. And one of the things I like about this particular brand and style, is that, first of all, I've never had one fail on me, knock on wood. Second of all, they're so much smaller and so much easier to work with in most amps that they fit in a lot more applications. If you're going to stock one type of capacitor, stock the one that is going to fit in the most wide-ranging applications possible, and that's why I do that. But look, I mean, there. Look at the difference in size there. This is an old Mallory. I think this is a Plas cap, and this is probably from the early 60s, maybe late 50s. But look at the difference in size. Here again, here's another one. See the difference in size. Here's another one. It's a mica mold Tropicap. Again, this one probably, you know, late 50s, somewhere around in there. I mean, look at the difference in size there. So, I mean, so you get the idea. Here's a Sangamo. And this actually is a pretty small, I think this was a I think this is probably a lower voltage rating, but even still, with the lower voltage rating, you know, late 50s Sangamo cap or early 60s, and the size difference, you know. So this cap is going to induce a lot more interference and noise than this one. But it really doesn't matter anyway. In most guitar amps, it's not going to matter a lick because you're, there just isn't, first of all, there isn't that much going on in most guitar amps. Now, if you have a really high gain guitar amp, you might want to pay some attention to the outer foil of your capacitors. It's particularly the ones that are closest to the input. You know, so anything from, say, the input to the first couple gain stages, if you have a really high gain amplifier, yeah, you probably want to pay some attention to that and try to get that right. But like I said, unless you have wires that are running really close to this or sitting right on top of it, you know, and it also have to be kind of parallel to it probably, or it wouldn't even induce anything. If it's going perpendicular to it, it probably wouldn't induce a damn thing. But if it's laying right up on beside of it, yeah, maybe, you know. And maybe on some boards that are poorly designed, you might get some inducted noise. But for the most part, dude, it's one of those things that you can really overthink. It's not that important, and usually 99% of the time I slap these things in, not caring a damn bit which way they go, and it doesn't matter. It never matters. And the only time it'll matter is, I mean, if you notice some noise, then you can go back and you can say, okay, well, what happened there? Because I'm noticing some noise that shouldn't be there. So at that point, you can kind of troubleshoot and say, okay, well, did I put one of those in backward? Is that what's going on? You can kind of move some wires around. And usually if that's what's going on, then you'll move one wire somewhere in the circuit, and just moving that wire will get rid of the noise. You know, if something is being induced like that. So honestly, dude, I wouldn't worry about it a single bit. But I mean, here's some more examples. Let's just, here, 0.05 is a really stark contrast. Here we go. 0.05 capacitor. Okay, this is a very common value in old amps. Look at this. Same value. Look at the size difference. This is late 50s or early 60s. I think this came out of a, and see, it designates the outer foil. Right there, you see that little stripe? See, this one doesn't have any stripe designating which of these legs connects to the outer foil and which connects to the inner foil. But with this one, it's a lot more critical because look at the size of this damn thing. That's a huge antenna. This one's not so huge. You know, here we go. Here's some more. Here's a Sangamo. Look at the size of that by comparison. Enormous. You know, so you get the idea here. Here's an old cap from a Fender, probably from a blackface or silverface Fender, mica mold, or what I think it's, or a molded cap, whatever. I'm sure you recognize these, but again, you know, it's got the foil side marked right here, or the outer foil side. But look how much bigger it is. This is ceramic on the outside, and it has like epoxy or something on the ends. But look, I mean, again, look at the size difference. So you get the idea. I mean, of what I'm saying here. You know, a lot of these caps, it's not going to matter because they're a lot smaller. This one came out of a mid 60s Gibson, probably, with this brown turd. I call them brown turd caps. But see, the outer foil is marked on this one as well. It's on this side, but it's a lot more critical when you have a little bit of a bigger capacitor like that. So, I mean, but it probably, honestly, in a guitar amp application, even this one wasn't critical to begin with to get correct. So there are a lot of things that really matter, and there are some things that don't matter quite so much. And I would say trying to get the outer foil correct on each and every one of your capacitors is kind of a fool's errand for guitar amp purposes. Now, again, there are going to be some applications where it's going to be mission critical to get that right. Probably in some hi-fi, maybe in some hi-fi applications, in some preamps that are really sensitive, maybe in some radio applications, perhaps it's critical to kind of get that right so you don't get any interference that builds up through the circuit. But on guitar amps, man, it's not all that critical, so take it with a grain of salt. All right, this question comes from Larry Adams, and he says, a buddy gave me a Zenith K731 radio. Would this old radio be worth converting into a lo-fi guitar amp? Well, Larry, first of all, let's see what this Zenith is. It's a K731, you say? First thing you want to do usually is try to find a schematic on something like this if you're, you know, trying to figure out whether it's going to be a good candidate. And I have found that radiomuseum.org is a very good website that has a lot of schematics. And it also will give you some general information, even without going and downloading the actual schematic. But in this case, this thing has 7 tubes. It has a 12DT8, a 12BE6, a 12BA6, another 12BA6, a 12AU6, a 19T8, and a 35C5. Okay, it doesn't really say, and I can't see the schematic. I would have to actually that's the one thing I don't like about this this particular website, radiomuseum.org. You have to actually request a download, so you have to go through all the rigmarole of like emailing them a request, and they will send it to you. And they will only send you so many per like month or so many per day. So like if a schematic is like 3 pages long and they'll only send you like 2 of the pages, you might have to wait a day or so before you can get the other page of the schematic. But it is at least nice that they're there, you know, and it's a resource. So I can't complain too much, but I don't think any of those tubes are a rectifier. So I'm guessing this is solid state rectified. The power tube will be the 35C5. The 12AU6 is probably the preamp tube for the audio output stage. A 19T8, what is that? Is that 3 triodes? No, it looks like a single triode with some diodes in there as well. It looks like 3 diodes and a triode together. And again, without downloading the schematic and knowing exactly how those are hooked up, I really couldn't say for sure. But yeah, it looks like, you know, you could probably use the audio output stage of this thing, and if you wanted to modify it and convert it for guitar use, you probably could. The thing is, it's you know, this is obviously, just by the fact that it has a 19 volt tube and a 35 volt tube in there, it's what's called a series filament amplifier. So what that means is the 120 volts comes in from the wall, and it's divided up. That voltage is divided up into each one of those tubes. So if you add up 35, 19, 12 times 4, and then 12 times 5, you know, you'll get somewhere close to 120 volts or thereabouts. That is a way that radio makers in the days of yore were able to come up with these circuits that cost a lot less because it did not require a power transformer. But that also makes the circuit a bit more dangerous if you're going to use it for guitar, because in a guitar application you have your hands on the guitar strings, and that has to be tied to a ground point. So usually the ground in any circuit is the chassis of the thing that you're plugged into. So if you plug the ground part into the chassis, you're basically plugging the strings into the chassis. And the thing is, there are only a couple of components inside of that amp now that are separating your fingers from 120 volts at the wall. You know, saying if you plug the amp in backwards, or if your house wiring is not correct, you know, there are a couple things that can kind of go wrong. And it would only take really a couple things to go wrong for that to be a really unsafe situation, and for you to be kind of in danger there. So, you know, that's why they call these amps Widowmaker amps, because they don't have any kind of transformer that's isolating you from the 120 volt wall voltage. So, and all that current, you know, that's behind it potentially. So it's you know, this is one of those things where it would require you to make this safe, you would really have to buy an isolation transformer and install it somewhere on the chassis. You would probably want to rip out all of the stuff that had to do with the radio to make room for the transformer. And it's just, you know, it's just a lot of work. And to be quite honest, that's a lot of work that you could put into something that was more apt for guitar. Something like an old hi-fi amp, an old organ amplifier like we discussed earlier, or, you know, something of that kind of ilk, or an old PA amp or something like that, you know, that already has a power transformer. If you can look at an amplifier and you can see that it has a really high number on one of the tubes, like a 35 or a 50 or 19 in this case, that's going to tell you anything basically above a 6 or a 12 you know, to start the name of one of the tubes is probably indicative of you having, and if it has no power transformer that you can see, if you look behind it and you see no power transformer, that should be a good clue that it's not the greatest candidate for something that you want to use for a guitar. I mean, you can do it and you can play it, but it's going to take you some modifying, and you know, unless you're real familiar with these types of circuits, I wouldn't recommend it as your first kind of conversion. I would definitely go with something that already had a power transformer. So hopefully that answers your question. Alright guys, that will do it for Shit Post Friday. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Hit subscribe down below if you have. And for now, we'll see y'all later.